Welcome to the Shipper of Choice webinar series live here at F3. I'm Tony Mulvey, joined by Rob Haddock at Albedo Logistics Solution. Rob, introduce yourself, kind of tell everybody what you do and how long you've been in this industry, because it's been quite some time.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me on the program this morning. Yeah, Rob Haddock, Albedo Logistics Solutions. You're going, what the heck is an Albedo? Let me explain where I was before, because I was over 4 decades with the Coca-Cola company, so I don't think there's much explanation needed there. I did planning and logistics for Coke ever since I was a wee lad, all the way up through my final days. Yeah, I stepped away from Coke last June, so I've been kind of retired. That's the running joke, because I seem to be more active now than I was before, but I'm giving back to the industry, and retired is just a phase. I don't have to get up at 8 o'clock every morning. I don't have a long day every day, 5 days. I can choose. So I enjoy the industry and the chase, and I think there's a lot of good work yet to be done. Albedo, what the heck is it? I was sitting on the beach a few years ago, and there was a beautiful sunset, and I was really curious, what do you call that shimmering light that the sun makes as it reflects across the water? And I looked it up, and it's a Latin word called albedo, and it kind of means the reflective light that creates a pathway. So I thought, well, logistics needs a path, albedo is a path. Maybe if I came up with something fancy like Albedo Logistics Solution, it's a pathway to a different tomorrow. So I had to really think hard about that for a supply chain guy. It's stretching me.
Hey, I think it's a perfect name, and I think it highlights some of the work you've done recently targeting shipper of choice. I mean, like you said, you were at Coca-Cola for 40 plus years. I mean, you've been in the industry around that and seen kind of advancements around shippers making efforts to become a shipper of choice. And I think a lot of what goes into this is, what is the value of actually doing the making efforts and making investments to set yourself apart to your carrier partners? Because at the end of the day, this is a relationship business, and having those relationships are vital, and moving away from a transactional, hey, you're doing a service for me for a certain price, to that relationship. Like, what is, in your time, what has been the number one reason why people have kind of made these investments, and kind of talk about what is that overarching value of being a shipper of choice?
That's a lot to unpack, Tony, so I'm glad we got some time here. I'm going to take you way back. Let's go back to the early 90s. And I'm not going to outline every year of my career, but back in the early 90s, I was responsible for a small warehouse in Northeast Ohio, and it was multi-shift operation, but not a real big operation. But we were constantly dealing with trying to schedule freight, get it in, have the carriers get it to where it needed to be on time. And one of the things I noticed, and it really started with the empathy towards the drivers, is that we weren't very good at always knowing what we wanted, so we'd always have these last-minute requests for freight. A carrier partner would find a driver, and then some driver would come in tired from the road, and they may not have been there for their appointment time, but we had a good line of sight as to when they were going to show up, so we would keep the warehouse open a little bit longer. 2 things: we needed to move the product to a customer, and then secondarily, these drivers are the ones that are really making it happen, and I would not want to be behind the wheel of a vehicle, a truck. So early on, I started to think about what's the value if we were able to get that driver in and out, and they can get on to, maybe they're getting to the rest area for some downtime, or maybe they're getting partway to where they need to be. But then also staying with the same carriers time and time again, because we weren't really good at knowing what we wanted, and if you don't have a relationship, you can't pick up the phone and ask for a favor because you've done nothing to earn the favor. So early on in the early 90s, I started to think about how do you become more efficient with your carrier partners, and how do you take care of the drivers at a better level? And it kind of stuck with me throughout my career.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing, and it kind of leads into the conversation we're going to have today. Over the course of the past few years, you've really highlighted kind of the 12 steps that shippers can take to become a shipper of choice. They're fairly easy. I mean, they range in difficulty, but I mean, a lot of the times it's just doing the small things at an extremely high level, and that's what separates those that are shipper, just your average run-of-the-mill shipper, right, that's playing in the market, and then the shipper of choice where the carrier partners are going to be there no matter the market conditions, because ultimately that's one of the values of being a shipper of choice is you're going to have access to that capacity when the market's changing, and you're likely going to find favorable rates.
Yeah, and I think that's, if I fast forward now, years 2017, the organization has gone through another restructuring, a very large one this time, because the Coca-Cola Enterprises operation was being disbanded. The North America division was resurfacing. The bottlers were independently getting larger territories. And I woke up on a Monday morning and I found out that I was responsible for all planning and logistics for North America. And it's like, okay, that was a big overnight change. Where do I start? So the planning piece was kind of already under control, but the transportation piece had gone through a lot of fragmentation over the years, and we had way too many carriers in our portfolio. So it was basically a transactional relationship everywhere. So we started to filter that down to carrier partners that understood our business and they could deliver the freight and be on time. But then also started a campaign of looking at the facilities and how well are they moving, and do we even know what our dwell time is at our docks? Do the facilities have an adequate restroom, vending machine, all of the things that you would just take for granted, but a lot of the facilities were a little bit lacking. About that same time, I was looking for help. I was looking out to other groups, and somehow our good old friend the internet provided me a white paper on somebody, I don't know who it was, but they'd written 5-6 pages on what it means to be a shipper of choice. I thought, well, I'll never be able to share this with anybody. I need to get it down to 1 page. So I took little snippets from each one of the 12 things that they had outlined, and I put it on 1-page PowerPoint, and I started to throw it in front of folks, whether it be the North America team or all the different bottler partners. And I said, hey, there's half a dozen of these that are targeted towards how you behave with your carrier partner. There's half a dozen of these that deal with the driver experience when they come to your facility. If we were able to do something above others, chances are, and now I'm going over to Eric Starks at FTR, yeah, he's saying that, well, chances are you're going to get capacity in tight times and you're going to get rates closer to the market. I thought, well, how hard can this be? So we started to go down that journey. Now, keep in mind that the network that I came from had 800 different facilities, and they still has 800. So when you're a driver, you don't know whether it's Coke this, Coke that. You just know Coke's on the bill of lading. So you have to get all of those facilities with a little bit different mindset as to how do I keep the driver moving so they have a better experience. And then the carrier partners, what's really a partnership versus the tactical whack-a-mole.
Absolutely. I think this is the perfect lead-in to breaking down the 12 steps of being a shipper of choice. I think the first one looks really high level. So starting at the facility review, looking from the top down across all your facilities. These are not necessarily driver amenities. That'll be another step. But this is more of what are the capabilities of a certain facility? Are there drop and hook? Because that's just a way to increase efficiency. What's the scheduling process look like? Just kind of break down what this review process looks like when looking at a facility.
Yeah, I think from at a facility level, kind of synchronize this in my mind that you've got the physical asset. So drop and hook, not everybody's fortunate enough to have drop and hook. Some of the facilities, especially if you've been around for a long time, your location might have been an open field one day and now it's got a neighborhood around you. So it can be very difficult. But if you have the luxury of a green space, make sure you got enough dock doors. Make sure you have the access that you need in and out of the facility. Make sure that you've got enough drop yard space. So if you could start to entertain, I always look at it as it's worth the investment if you can turn the trailer in and out in 30 minutes versus the traditional 2 hours, 3 hours that it might be involved with a live load. Because you don't think about, the driver's in the dock for an hour, hour and a half, let's hope. But they may have gotten there a little bit sooner because they landed earlier versus the appointment because they didn't want to be late. Maybe they've got to walk from the guard shack, which I would like to reterm the welcome center. They've had to go from the welcome center to the dispatch office, yada yada. Sometimes their load is loaded, but Timmy on the dock hasn't give Sally the paperwork, so it hasn't been closed out. And 2 hours later, the driver's still sitting there going, "Come on, I got to get on the road." So if you can do the drop and hook, that's great. Some of the facilities, it's very difficult to get into. You're dodging traffic. So the access and the departure infrastructure is important to get these big trucks in and out safely. And then when you're on the facility itself, a welcome center versus the security desk or the shipping office. I've been to way too many shipping offices where the poor driver is standing there against a wall of "thou shalt not do," and "if you do, thou shalt be whatever." And then they finally get their paperwork, and the person there is snapping at them. I'm going, geez, why can't we just kind of make this like you're checking into a hotel? It doesn't have to be a 5-star, but greet the driver with a smile, make them feel welcome for a minute.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because when you look at it, it's like there's ways now to kind of even expedite that process to take, I don't want to say take that element, the human element, I don't even call it moodiness to some degree of it, but there's ways around it to kind of automate things like that. Do you think that is an area as we move forward in just little things like that, where the waiting for paperwork that limits that time frame, the having to go walk to get the paperwork for a driver to make sure everything's there? I mean, is that one of the areas that as we move forward in the industry as a whole is going to set shippers apart, making them a shipper of choice?
Yeah, I think it is, Tony. I mean, you think about the fast pass at any major amusement park. You want to get in, you want to get on the ride, you want to get to the next one. The drivers want to do the same thing. I know during the pandemic, we were experimenting with a number of touchless bills of lading concepts. So you wouldn't have to check in at the guard shack. You wouldn't have to go to the shipping office. You could just digitally tell them you were there, and they would assign you a door, and you may not ever talk to anybody during your whole visit. So you get on your way quicker. The studies indicated that for those facilities that were doing it, they were shaving an hour, hour and a half off the process. Now, you still got to load it if it's a live load, but a lot of the facilities were pretty good at getting things loaded once a trailer was in the dock. Since I left, I know that program's expanded. I've not seen any of those folks here kind of in the tech hall on this at this event, but I know that's an underlying thing, and we did it. Touchless was a thing to make sure that the drivers didn't have interaction during the pandemic, so it wasn't another way to spread COVID. But when you think about it from an efficiency play, it makes sense, and it's not that big of a lift to get there.
Absolutely, and I think now moving one step further, we've talked about the facility as a whole, but that's just one element that the driver interacts with, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they would like to have amenities, and they don't have to be, you mentioned it, like the hotel reference, they don't have to be 5-star, but the basics of, is there a bathroom? Is there a vending machine, right? You don't have to provide them with, call it free water, free food, drinks, but something that they have access to go do, internet, Wi-Fi. I mean, it's so readily available now in most places. Is it available for the drivers when they're on site? I mean, when you're looking, or when you talk to shippers in this instance, what are the first things you tell them to look at, and what are the easiest kind of tweaks that a shipper can make that's really going to make them stand out in this kind of area?
Yeah, I think in that driver amenity area, and I've been told by some of the folks, well, we don't want to make them feel too comfortable, right? We want to keep them moving. I said, well, yeah, I got it, but what's the harm of having a soft drink machine, a snack machine, maybe, you know, a TV, ESPN running in the background. And granted, keep them in and out as quickly as possible, keep them moving. But you know, if you could do that bare minimum, Wi-Fi may be a nice thing, but you know, that was kind of balked at once again. But some facilities out there do have Wi-Fi, so it does become very beneficial for the driver. The inverse that we had to correct immediately is, you know, a his and her porta potty out in the backyard in Arizona is not an amenity, right? That's rather barbaric. So it's like, let's get rid of some of that stuff and make sure that we have at least somewhere where the drivers can feel like we want them to be there.
Yeah, and it's things like that are fairly small when you think about, like, in the grand scheme of the operation. And I think sometimes it's like, oh, it's an added cost. It's an upfront cost to do things. But at the end of the day, it becomes a wash in the long run, because if you are setting yourself apart and getting favorable market rates, you're not as subjected to market swings. The capacity's there. You kind of, yes, it's a cost here, but there's benefits down the road, and it's making that investment on the front end. And do you think, from a shipper perspective, sometimes it gets lost that it's, hey, this is an investment we need to make, because it doesn't actually, at the end of the day, their business is selling a good, and that making sure that good is either on the shelf or to their customer, and the transportation is kind of that middle section of it. It impacts their business if something doesn't show up. But do you think it's a factor of they need to look at it from this is something we need to do to elevate ourselves overall, because it just makes our entire business function better, as opposed to looking at it as hey, this is an added cost to what we think of as a cost center already?
Yeah, I think the way I would answer that, Tony, is that, and I've experienced this throughout my career, is that the logistics portion of the supply chain is probably the least understood and appreciated within not only the supply chain, but in the whole leadership of an organization. And when logistics which is warehousing and transportation, is kind of looking for investment dollars, a lot of times they are going up with a marketing program or a sales program on shelf, or in the case of manufacturing, a new piece of equipment. And what's put logistics at a disadvantage is that, you know, your $1 million, when you compare it to the $1 million of those other groups that they may want to invest, they can really articulate well what the return on investment is. Yeah, these commercials are gonna create a lift. This sales price is gonna drive more volume. This case packer is gonna improve output. When you talk about what's the benefit of logistics, you know, well, you're going, well, my $1 million should, I hope, maybe will, you know, there's not that direct line of sight that it's really going to lead to benefits at the bottom line. There's an assumption that it will, and it's the right thing to do, but that's the trouble with a logistics management group, is trying to sell that concept and then actually get the deliverable happening.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, is like the value's still there. It's sometimes not seen on the P&L, but it is there. It is there because at the end of the day, you still need that capacity to show up, the drivers to show up. So taking care of the drivers, in essence, is ensuring that your product is getting where it needs to be in the fast and safe and at a fair rate. And I think ultimately that's what shippers are looking for, and making small investments in how they treat their drivers, or the drivers that are interacting with them, is going to be what sets them apart from those that maybe don't. I think one of the things you touched on earlier is the flexibility, right? The ability to how warehouses, docks are able to be flexible, because we can drive here in Chattanooga, and the way you drive, it depends on what time you leave the city. You could be stuck in traffic for an hour, or you could have no traffic, and these things pop up all over the country. How do you think having this flexibility plays out from a shipper of choice? Like, what do you see is how much flexibility does one need to bake in to a dock schedule to kind of set themselves apart?
When we were first onboarding some track and trace technology, we were very curious as to see what percentage of trucks were late for their appointment on a day-to-day basis. So we did the study for about 6 months, and we found out that any given day, 20% of the trucks were not going to make it as scheduled. Now, the hope was in the track and trace, we would get early warning and that we could start to reschedule them later in the day rather than waiting for them to sit multiple days, which can happen at some shippers and receivers. But also part of the analysis indicated that about 20% of the trucks were showing up earlier than their appointment because they wanted to get to the facility and avoid being late. Because maybe they had to drive through Atlanta and all of a sudden they got lucky. You know, it only took them an hour versus 3. So now you land, you're still on the clock, you got hours of service, but your appointment's not for another couple of hours. What do? It's waste. So, you know, the dynamic scheduling flexibility is imperative if you're in a live load environment to get those trucks that have shown up early on their way, get them into a door, knowing that your scheduled pickups later or pickups later in the day will probably have some misses. So it kind of balances itself out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing overall is like the ability to have that flexibility. Like it takes some of the unknown of what a driver is going to encounter on the way. It takes it out of it to some degree because like you said, you can drive through Atlanta and I've done it plenty of times that sometimes it's a breeze and other times it's the biggest nightmare on earth, right? But I think you also touched on this earlier, the ease of access around a facility. How easy is it to navigate around a facility? I think some of that goes into a flexibility and having the ease of access can almost go together, right? If it's easy to get to, it's like, hey, you were going to be at door 30 and now you're going to be at 70 and maybe it's on a different side of the building, but knowing how to get there, the easiest way to get there it can kind of go hand in hand. Am I thinking about that in the correct way? Like from a driver perspective, if they know exactly where to go, the flexibility with them, right? It makes things easier for them as a whole.
I think too, repeat drivers coming to facilities is always a benefit. I think one of the other things I've witnessed is that, you know, I hung out in the shipping office for a couple of hours in one of our Southern California DCs just to see what it was like when the drivers came to the window to get their paperwork. And what I was amazed with, and this was mostly for those drivers who were operating for a brokerage firm, is that they would come to the window with the wrong bit of information. Because in today's world where there's a lot of security risk and theft going on, it's imperative that they have the right references or else they're not going to get that load released to them. But you know, one driver in particular, and I think I overheard the driver was running for brokerage X, and I just happened that the next day I was going to be with brokerage X, so I shared the experience. And I think that driver was still looking for the right number 2 hours later as I was leaving the facility. He was still swinging and missing. And so it's just those little things all the way through. You might have actually gotten into the facility, got to the shipping window, and then there's a gap on the information you need, which then once again wastes time.
Yeah, and I think the whole element about shipper of choice is at the end of the day, it reduces some of this wasted time. It creates efficiency within supply chains and transportation networks, but it also sets you apart from a shipper or from a carrier perspective. I think one of the interesting ones, one of these steps is looking at, is overnight parking available? I think one of the most impactful things that a driver is looking for is safe, reliable parking. I mean, you walk down this hall, there's multiple truck parking ideas and ways of going about it. And I think it's one of those that you don't often think about, but it's one of the top issues that truck drivers face. I mean, how hard and where does that need to come into play to set yourself as a shipper of choice? Because not every facility is going to be available or capable of handling overnight parking, but those that have the access or the ability to handle it, I mean, what's the downside risk to not offering it?
I mean, from my perspective, if you're a CPG shipper, that you should be considering that where you can. You don't want to put the driver on the road knowing that there's a risk that their hours of service are going to run out, and they end up on an exit or entrance ramp for their overnight stay, because that has got danger written all over it. And I can't believe how many truck drivers have to do that, because it's a shame. I think that's it's another thing that would be an additional benefit, because the driver community, they talk, whether it be through social media, or I know Uber was working on a facility rating program, which I thought was really robust. I helped them kind of design what it should look like. And there's a associated cost with every one of those ratings that, think about going to a restaurant or going into a hotel. If it's a 2-star restaurant or a 2-star hotel, you're expecting a low cost, right? And maybe you get food poisoning along the way. You never know. The inverse happens with facility ratings. If you're a 2 facility, you better know that you are going to have to incent drivers to come see you, because the word on the street is that you're not very efficient. And that cost of inefficiency, what's the difference between a 2 and a 3, or a 3 and a 4? It could be $50, $100 a load. Studies that we've done on poorly ranked facilities through Google searches, and then we compare what our cost is versus the market, and we're like, oh my gosh, we're 10, 15% higher. Well, why is that? Well, it's because you've got to incent the driver to go there.
Yeah, and we've talked about it before, and it's having the conversations with your customers as well from the shipper perspective, because that driver, when they make a delivery, they're pulling up, they may not be dropping off at the same facility, they're definitely not dropping off at the same facility, but it may have a different name, right? A different company name. And those areas, so working together collaboratively from a shipper perspective is important, because if they pick up at a Coke facility, per se, and drop off at Target, Walmart, any of the major retailers, the names on the dock are representing the company, right? At the end of the day, do you think like that element of it is this collaboration will also help advance people to become shippers to become a shipper of choice? Because I think at some point it's, hey, they see the name and had a bad experience, and they're like, we won't move anything from there, and then they show up and they don't realize that it's actually someone else's freight.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, I've had some interactions with Adam DeGroot at Dock 411, and I know they're trying to build out also things that help the drivers, like facility information that you could readily reference when you're on your way, to make sure that you know what you're getting into. Yeah, and I think all of these little types of things that different companies are working on, over time they will kind of come together as a real network of information, so a driver can make better informed decisions as to which tenders they're going to take or not.
Absolutely. We've got about 15 minutes left, so kind of let's switch gears. We've really talked about the driver element of this, but there's another side of being a shipper of choice, and that's with like carrier management teams, because at the end of the day, the driver is the one moving the freight, but typically they're not necessarily the one working with the shipper to book the freight. And I think one of the first steps from that perspective is, are shippers accurately forecasting their lanes? How many do they actually reflect what's going on with the volume? Because I think that's an element that can get lost is, hey, we're offering you 100 loads for a carrier. The carrier builds a network around that, And in reality, then they only get 50, and it's like, well, now the carrier has disrupted their business by not having an accurate forecast.
Yeah, a little bit of background there on lane forecasting. It's because I came up through the planning organization, I was very interested in the forecast. You know, if I've got shipments going to a major retailer, I want to know what it is they want. Yeah. So I'm thinking, well, why would I not want to share my forecast with my supplier? And it happens when you do a bill of materials explosion. It goes all the way up to the can supplier, et cetera, because that's very critical in making sure that your production lines can run. But then we seem to forget about the importance of, you know, do I have enough storage space, or do I have the right number of trucks to get it moved from A to B? So Gartner says that, you know, transportation lane forecasting is one of the most critical elements in the logistics space, but it's also at its infancy. It's the most immature. And I think it could be easily accomplished if shippers just work with their ERP systems to say, okay, I've got all these cases, I'm going to put it in the warehouse. I know what the forecast is by my major customers. I just need to translate it into trucks.
Yeah.
And then I need to tie that truck volume to my awarded volume that I'm issuing every time I do an RFP. And oh, by the way, along the way, I should do some lane management to make sure that I'm living up to my piece of the bargain and that the carrier has got a decent, you know, primary tender acceptance. And if you could hit all of those aspects, now the carrier is not wondering if those loads are going to come through, because they're building a network assuming that the load comes through so they can deliver and then go down the road and pick up another and deliver, yada, yada, yada. All it takes is one individual to give you some bad information, and that driver might not have the next load. Is it available? Yes. Do most shippers realize the importance? No. Is it what keeps me going? Yes, because I think we could do better.
Yeah, and I think it actually plays well in a period like we've experienced the last few years, right? Where the carriers are searching, I would say searching for freight, just because there's so many options out there, but at least giving a forecast allows them to kind of be somewhat flexible throughout the time. Again, flexibility seems to be one of the biggest trends here, but I think one of the interesting ones that we'll touch on is payment and how payment terms are structured, because we've been in a soft freight environment. I don't think it's any surprise in here. We're coming out of that, but what was interesting is at the beginning of this freight recession, and really even last year, payment terms being structured and pushing them out to 120, 180 days in some cases. Carriers waiting to get paid 3 to 6 months after they do a service. It's really hard when they're in an environment such as this where rates are depressed. At that time, fuel expenses were up. So like they had things working against them, and then this is just one more element that was working against them because it hampers their cash flow to some degree. I mean, what would separate a shipper to become a shipper of choice around payment terms?
Right. I mean, I think the traditional payment terms of 30 days, which we seem to drift from. I think the railroads still expect 15, but I know that some payment terms have gone out as many as, like you said, 120, 180 days. Now, the shippers do say, yes, but we have financing. What is it, payment financing? I can't remember the right term right now, but you know, it's still like I did the work. Why am I not getting paid? We don't come to work every day and go, well, that was nice, but you won't get your paycheck for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, right? You expect some type of gratification. I think it's definitely a differentiator. But I think the other thing is that the shippers who have done it, they've somewhere in the finance group, they said, well, we're going to get all of this maybe one-time money in a particular year, because you can't do it every year. Once you do it, you take this benefit of deferred payments, which helps your bottom line. But it really does then put a lot of stress on the carriers who are cash-strapped.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And at the end of the day, when that happens, it kind of splinters relationships. And that's one of the areas we've talked about it a bunch, the shipper-carrier relationship. moving away from the transaction, making it more of a partnership. I think this goes into the next one of the steps in this is how do you manage relationships? Like what does that look like? If you're a shipper trying to become a shipper of choice, how do you need to be looking at these relationships? How do you need to be managing them to really stand out?
Well, I think there's a shared metrics component when it comes to a relationship, and I know there's an article coming out that one of the large organizations who just left one organization and got absorbed by another one. You guys can probably read out who that is, but I've been working with them on what are the shared metrics that a shipper and a carrier should really have. And I've been a big advocate that the shippers should really be responsible for dock management and keeping dwell time down, the whole appointment process, and also the volume, so forecasting. And then the carrier, if the shipper's doing this, then the carrier is signing up for, well, I'm going to have a high primary tender, I'm going to deliver on time, and I'm going to deliver a rate that's reasonable, market-based rate. And I think that's what the foundation of a relationship is that you've got to have metrics that you're working together with your partner to say, we're doing okay in these areas, or here are the spots where I have problems, or maybe this is not a good lane match for me, or maybe your facility X needs to improve their game because every time I go there, my drivers are having a terrible experience. If you can have those conversations, also with a very rationalized carrier group, then I think you're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that it's being able to have, and sometimes they're challenging conversations to have, right? Because at the end of the day, from the shipper perspective, again, it's not the core to their business. So, but it's so valuable in the long term because at the end of the day, it has to happen, right? You have to have transportation, and you want the reliable, consistent carrier partners to always be there when the market tightens, like it did during COVID, and even now, and those that kind of avoid playing the market to some degree, that they're going to be the ones that really stand out. And I think you touched on it a little, looking at dwell times and mitigating dwell times. From a driver perspective, they're paid by the mile, but they're subject to hours of service. So they're hampered by a clock, which kind of works. They can work against each other in a sense where dwell times get extended to, 2-3 hours. How does, for a shipper to become a shipper of choice, how do they need to take in, well, one, how do you mitigate any dwell time risk? Two, what does that kind of benchmark need to be? Because it can be different at different facilities. And I think, again, going back to the partner, the relationship, carriers will understand kind of the nuances of what dwell times at different facilities may look like. Mm-hmm. But how does a shipper kind of mitigate those risks?
Well, as I think about the way that it probably should flow, if we could ever get there, and I think the sophistication exists, is that, just say, Tony, you've got to pick up this afternoon. It's at 3 o'clock. You want to be on the road by 5. You don't want to really get to the 3 o'clock appointment any sooner than probably 2, right? Because you want to minimize your investment because those are times where you're not getting paid. You might get a little bit of compensation for your wait time, but it by no means offsets the miles. So it's the understanding by the shipper that those prices that they're embedded in their rate. I've seen studies where there's the miles that you drive, and then there's probably 10 to 15% inefficiency cost built in. And I've been a big fan of if you could separate that out and help the shipper understand what those inefficiencies are costing them by load, maybe that would help drive a little bit different behavior.
Yeah, we talked in one of these discussions earlier this year, kind of when you look at it from a holding a driver and the lack of efficiency there by them having extended dwell times versus adding one additional labor hour to try to get that driver moving. like the labor cost is far less than what it costs for delays on the dock from a driver sitting there. I mean, is that an area that shippers need to really extend, to separate themselves as a shipper of choice? They need to look at and be like, okay, does it make sense to bring in a little extra labor to really speed up the process, whether it's adding an extra hour to the dock schedule, or is it, hey, we know our dwell times are call it 2 hours. If we can get 10 minutes off of that, that's just a little bit further that the driver can go. If it's like, what needs to really be the focus, I guess, when we look at this?
Yeah, I think the financial analysis on the back end of the supply chain is probably lacking more than other areas. There's still too much reliance on Excel to understand how to break down the different costs, not only with the shipper, but I think there's a lot of probably real antiquated tools within the carriers in terms of how do I break out that cost. So there's no overnight solution. I knew way back in the 90s that if I spent a little bit of overtime keeping a lift truck operator around, I would benefit. I don't necessarily know how to translate that 30 years quicker into the future with all the technology. It's all there. It's just the understanding of how do you lower the bottom cost. For us, it was, for every dollar I don't spend on transportation, I can give it back to the commercial teams. They can figure out how to sell more products. So there's the hook.
I think that's the key, is if transportation can find a way to mitigate any overage, like blowing the budget out of the water, and work together with carrier partners, at the end of the day, the relationship's going to be stronger. And I think the key here is this long term, and it brings us really to the final step of becoming a shipper of choice. It's thinking long term. Transportation, a lot of times, is very short-sighted, and what's happening in this moment, knowing that it's a very cyclical environment, but thinking long term over the course of not just one full cycle, but multiple cycles. I mean, how does a shipper need to think about that process and really advancing overall?
This is a great story to close on. I was fortunate. A lot of times the leaders of the transportation group turn rather quickly through the organization. I got to be there 6-7 years, so I got to live through a couple of cycles. And when I started to look back in 2024 to say, what did we do right during that time, I kind of drew out a resiliency map. And starting back in 2017, which was just on the start of the ELD meltdown, we knew that we weren't very competitive, we weren't very efficient. So as we started to try and make the pain go away, we implemented different steps, different technologies, different processes. So 19 was a little bit of relief. We improved our game. All of a sudden now we wake up where we're in a COVID environment. But surprisingly, the steps that we took over that two-year period where, we reduced our carrier base by 75%. Our volume doubled during that time. But my primary tender acceptance during COVID stayed relatively high versus my competition, because we had, in that short period of time, we had built the relationships with a carrier base that knew that we were going to be there for the long term, so they stuck with us through that period. So primary tenders stayed rather robust. Costs were in line, and I'm going, what are you guys all worried about? I'm not feeling the pressure.
Awesome stuff. So Rob, we got about a minute left. Kind of just final closing thoughts. What should be top of mind for shippers if they want to become a shipper of choice? And where can people find more info about you and all the work you're doing around shipper of choice?
All right. Well, I'm out there on LinkedIn. I do a live podcast every 4 to 6 weeks to talk a little bit about the market. I've got kind of a shipper of choice cheat sheet, so to speak, a little deck as to what steps I took over time. So anybody who's interested, feel free to reach out. And resiliency. If you don't have a resiliency game plan, now is the time. Everybody's thinking that the freight recession is over, which means great for the carrier community, not so good for the shippers. So if you've been sitting back doing nothing for the last 2 years, just living on hope, you may have a rude awakening when your 2025 budgets.
Awesome stuff. Well, thank you, Rob, for joining us here at F3 and the Shipper of Choice webinar.